After 2 home console entries, it is well past time for another portable foray into the world of Fire Emblem. But rather than creating a brand new entry in the series, Intelligent Systems opted to recreate the first game of the series for the Nintendo DS. This remake would be the first time North American gamers would be exposed to the very first entry of the Fire Emblem series. Well, officially that is. This remake is Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, releasing on February 16, 2009 on Nintendo's dual-screen system. Now, this isn't the first time the original Fire Emblem has been remade. Back in the early 90s, the third game of the series contained a remake of the first Fire Emblem along with its sequel. This game released for the Super Famicom and remains exclusive to Japan. It even got its own DS remake shortly after Shadow Dragon, which is also Japanese exclusive. As luck would have it, both games have been fully translated by fans, so they are available in English, but we're getting sidetracked here, so without further ado, let's get straight to it. Welcome to the Dark Age of Fire Emblem. Well, calling Shadow Dragon the Dark Age of Fire Emblem may be a bit drastic, but you have to consider that this game would be the last Fire Emblem game to receive a North American release for 4 long years, until Fire Emblem Awakening released in 2013. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon takes place on the continent of Arcania. 100 years ago, this land was invaded by the Dole Empire led by the Shadow Dragon Medeus. But under the leadership of the Altean hero Anri, and with his holy sword Falchion, Medeus was defeated, but fast forward to when the game takes place and the continent of Arcania is once again at war, with the evil sorcerer Garneth resurrecting Medeus in hopes of conquering the continent. The game's narrative revolves around Anri's descendant and crown prince of Altea, Marth. After being forced to flee his home and live on an island of Talius for many years, Marth sets out to reclaim his kingdom and defeat Garneth and the Shadow Dragon Medeus. You can pretty much tell this game's age from this plot synopsis alone, but back when the game released in 1990, this wasn't exactly the norm yet. But in 2009 when this remake released, yeah, it did contain pretty much every cliche in the book, but for a title this old, I'd argue the story is somewhat of a classic tale, and it's fairly well told. However, this remake expands upon the original story by adding several new prologue chapters which further details the fall of Altea and how Marth escaped. There's even a part where Marth, or rather you the player, is forced to sacrifice 1 unit in order to buy Marth time to escape. There are also a couple of new characters and story sections added throughout the game to further flesh out this relatively simple story, but compared to pretty much every other game in the series, this story is really nothing special, and it isn't even really told in any manner near as interesting as any of those other titles. But like I said earlier, this is a classic story, and it can kind of be forgiven for its narrative shortcomings. However, what I don't really think can be forgiven is the lack of any character development and support conversations. Actually, there isn't even a support system at all. If you thought some of the characters of Radiant Dawn weren't very well developed, just wait till you meet this game's cast. Since there really isn't any sort of support system, most of the characters only get a few lines of dialogue and that's it. And because of that, I couldn't really get attached to anyone, which in turn gives you very little incentive to keep everyone alive, especially since the majority of characters that join you on this journey have absolutely terrible stats and cannot hope to compete with your units you've had since the beginning of the game. This is especially prevalent during the late game. These problems also tie in with another issue this game has, the Gaiden chapters. If you recall my review of Fire Emblem Rekka no Ken, or Fire Emblem on the Game Boy Advance, you may remember me talking about Gaiden chapters, or side chapters, which were unlockable side missions that would reward you with extra characters and items upon completing them. I haven't really mentioned them since then, as none of the other games have really had them. Point being, Gaiden chapters make a return here in Shadow Dragon. The only problem with that being, the only way to access them is to purposely kill your units. You see, to unlock a Gaiden chapter, you must have less than 15 units in your character roster. So unless you have people dying regularly, you will not be able to play these Gaiden chapters, and because this game is so damn easy, having characters die is a bit of a problem. I'll address the lack of a difficulty a little later, but the moral of the story here is that the only way I could play these Gaiden chapters is by purposely stripping some of my units of all their equipment and sending them to die, which I had no problem doing as many of these characters are completely useless and the roster is quite large. Did I mention not many of them get any real development? And you want to know what's even worse? After you lose enough units, the game provides you with nameless generic soldiers to refill your roster with, which results in you repeating this death march process until you have less than 15 characters and okay. Bottom line being that I'm quite disappointed in this missed opportunity to develop these classic characters, and I really wish that these Gaiden chapters were far better implemented into the core game. But to the game's credit, there are some conversations that actually expand upon these characters' personalities. Unfortunately, there are very limited conversations that only occur between specific characters, so not everyone gets them, and these talks don't actually influence gameplay, but I guess it's better than nothing. So with all that out of the way, let's discuss something more positive, the gameplay. Oddly enough, the original game did not feature the weapons triangle and some of the other subsystems that many fans associate with the series. Shadow Dragon adds some of them, like the aforementioned weapons triangle, but again, I was slightly disappointed with the inability to rescue units among other gameplay system omissions. So what you get from Shadow Dragon gameplay-wise is the tried and true classic turn-based formula that makes the series so addictive and oh so incredibly good. This remake does a really good job at modernizing this original title so that it plays as a series fan would expect it to, which for the most part is great. Again, there is a but to this, but this results in the end product feeling very minimalistic compared to pretty much every other entry, and on one hand I can appreciate this back to the basics approach, but on the other I long for a more satisfying and in-depth gameplay experience. It doesn't really feel like Intelligent Systems went the full mile to completely refresh this classic game. Instead, it comes off feeling like they did what was necessary and left it at that. However, there are some new concepts in practice here, the main one being the reclassing system. This simple system allows you to change the classes of your units, which grants a bit of experimentation and replayability. This system does feel a bit unnecessary, but it does give some pre-promoted units another shot at being useful, as some of these units have the potential to receive level ups that increase their stats by more than one increment. Another new feature for the series introduced here is the online multiplayer. Back before Nintendo shut down the DS's and Wii's online services, you could battle other players head-to-head in online battles, as well as access an item shop that granted you access to special items, like a special promotion option. This was actually a pretty neat feature, but sadly it's now gone. Shadow Dragon also allows you to save mid-battle if one of your units touches a runic circle on the map. The best part is that you get 2 slots for these battle saves and you can reload them at any point. This save system makes the game even better for on-the-go trips. So, from a gameplay standpoint, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is severely lacking, but the core gameplay is still as fun as it's ever been, and Intelligent Systems should be applauded for their efforts on modernizing this title while still retaining the spirit of the original. Now, before I move on, I need to address the game's difficulty. Somehow, despite the fact that Shadow Dragon has over 6 difficulty levels, the game's an absolute breeze, possibly being the easiest game of the entire series. I found that every difficulty aside from the most difficult option was a near cakewalk, presenting very little challenge. So this game is best suited to newcomers, and for any veterans I'd highly recommend starting that first playthrough on one of the harder difficulty settings. While the overall gameplay is for the most part good, the same cannot be said for the game's overall visual quality. Instead of using sprites like the previous portable entries, Shadow Dragon follows in the footsteps of the console entries and uses 3D models for battle animations. Here, each unit's 3D model looks incredibly boring and plain. They don't even have any faces. What's even worse is that the unit distinction is at an all-time low, with practically every unit using the same models as one another, and the overall animation quality for these battles, while being fairly competent, is still very boring to watch. Outside of battles, the overall map and unit models look okay and do their job, but nothing really past that. However, the character portraits and illustrations look great. Apparently Intelligent Systems got the artist of the Ghost in the Shell manga to help with the character design, and you can definitely tell as they all look great, especially when compared to their original designs. So overall, the graphics are for the most part underwhelming aside from the character portraits, and it's a real shame too, as this would have been an excellent opportunity to once again use sprite-based visuals in the vein of the Game Boy Advance Fire Emblems. But luckily, the music is probably the best thing going for this remake outside of the core gameplay. The majority of the soundtrack consists of remixes from the original, all of which sound amazing. Sound effects have also been completely redone and sound much better, so no real surprise here. Ultimately, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon succeeds as a remake of a classic title that never saw the light of day outside of Japan, but as a continuation of the Fire Emblem series, it falters. This is not a bad game. I've enjoyed my time spent with it across 5 or so playthroughs, and as long as you have the expectations of playing a classic RPG from the 90s, I'd say you'll find Shadow Dragon to your liking. A full playthrough of Shadow Dragon should take around 20 hours, and luckily, unlike some of the other entries of the series, online prices aren't too absurd just yet. A boxed copy goes for around 40 bucks. Well, that's all for now. I hope you all join me for the final installment of this Fire Emblem retrospective, as I'll be looking at what may very well be the most important game of the whole series, Fire Emblem Awakening. As always, has been Darren the Gaming Pilgrimage. Till next time. Hey everyone, we're once again at that sensitive time. We're at the end of the retrospective, and I'm going to need your suggestions for what I should do next. Do you want to see me cover Breath of Fire, maybe cover some Suikoden? Let me know in the comments. I'm pretty much willing to cover any RPG series or even a series outside of that. But before we get to that, I do have to finish this Fire Emblem retrospective, which will conclude my review of Fire Emblem Awakening. But that video might take a little bit longer, as I don't currently have a 3DS capture card, and I gotta experiment with some camera angles, some lighting, just trying to get the right effects so the video actually looks good. So in the meantime, I created a podcast over on Podomatic.com called the Gaming Pilgrimage Podcast. So if you want to hear more of my voice in the meantime, you can check it over there and do it to my buddies. It's a good time. And I'm hoping to make it a weekly affair. So if you're over there, hopefully you enjoy it. And I'm looking to get it on iTunes really soon. I'm just waiting on approval. So till next time.